Welcome back to my channel, where it's all about the HOA drama. I am your host, and today we have an amazing story from Florida. The HOA sent security to my lakefront ranch. They left crawling after I shattered their shins. Welcome to my channel, where it's all about the HOA drama. I'm your host, and today we have an amazing story from Florida. The title says it all, but let's see how our neighbor got there. Let's go ahead and dive right into this crazy world of HOA drama. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up if you like these stories. Our neighbor was a 72-year-old man who lived on the lakefront property. He had a single-story lakefront ranch with a dock. He also had a brand new boat he kept on the dock. Our neighbor wasn't really much of a boater. He would take his boat out once or twice a month at most. But because of that, he had his dock built by professionals, and he hired a company to keep his dock clean so that his boat would always be ready to go. He also had cameras installed around the entire perimeter of his house, and he had them hooked up to monitors inside the house. He also had a state-of-the-art security system. You know, one of those that when you walk up to the door, it recognizes your face. If it's not a recognized face, then it sends alerts to the police. He even had a big sign in front of his house that warned you that there were cameras everywhere. Well, our neighbor just bought this boat, and it was literally sitting on the dock waiting for him to use it. This made some of the neighbors jealous. It also made the board members jealous because they wanted his dock. See, the HOA owned all of the docks, and the board had been trying to get our neighbor to turn over his dock so they could put it somewhere else. They didn't want it on the lake anymore. They wanted it in the parking lot so they could use it for meetings. Now, the thing is, they offered him a fair trade. They would give him the parking lot space, and they would give him a dock in the parking lot to store his boat. He would just have to move his boat off the lake and park it in the parking lot. He refused that offer. He said no way in hell was he going to park his boat in the parking lot. He paid good money for a lakefront property so he could put his boat in the lake. So now the HOA was out for his blood. They started sending him letters every other week about his dock. At first it was just about normal dock maintenance and keeping it free of obstructions and stuff like that. But then it started to become more threatening. Then the president of the board personally called our neighbor and told him he had until the end of the month to remove his dock or they would take action. Action being that they would remove his dock and fine him. Well, our neighbor still said no way. He was not giving up his dock. So the day before the ultimatum was supposed to expire, the HOA calls the cops on him. The cops come out and tell our neighbor he has until tomorrow to remove his dock or they will confiscate it. Well, our neighbor tells them to go ahead because he has cameras recording everything. So the next morning the cops came back with a locksmith. The locksmith tried to break into the house, but there were no doors unlocked. So then he tried to break in through a window. Still nothing. So he tried another window, and that's when the alarm went off. Apparently it registered his face, and it was letting the police know he was there. When the police finally got into the house, they found out it was empty. That's when they checked the cameras and saw that our neighbor had moved his boat and removed his dock. He beat them to the punch. When the police got out to the dock, they realized the boat was gone and the dock was gone. There was not a trace of it anywhere. They did find our neighbor out on the lake boating with a huge grin on his face. Well, the HOA wasn't having it. They sued him for breach of contract. They said that by removing his dock, he breached the agreement between him and the HOA. He said he did no such thing. He was actually doing what the HOA told him to do. The HOA told him to move his dock or they would take action. He removed his dock. What action? They took possession of his dock. They couldn't sue him for breach of contract. It was the HOA that breached the contract. Well, then the HOA decided to take matters into their own hands. One night while our neighbor was asleep, the HOA sent a security team to his house to break into his house and hook up his car and tow it away. It wasn't their place to do so, but they did it anyways. When our neighbor woke up, he was pissed. He knew the HOA was behind it because only the HOA had access to his security system. He called the police and told them about the situation. The police told him there was nothing they could do. The HOA had a security team watching his house. They knew the police were coming and they were prepared for it. He called the HOA and asked why they had towed his car. They told him that he didn't pay his HOA fees. He told them that he did pay his HOA fees. The HOA told him that he didn't pay them in full. He told them that he did. And if they didn't return his car, he was gonna take legal action against them. The HOA cowered and returned his car, but they weren't done yet. A few days later, a representative from the HOA knocks on our neighbor's door to ask him why he hasn't paid his HOA fees. Our neighbor opens the door and asks him what he wants. The HOA rep asks him if he paid his HOA fees. Our neighbor says he did. The HOA rep says he didn't and he needs to pay them right now or they're going to send a locksmith to his house again. Well, our neighbor invited him in. Our neighbor showed the HOA rep his computer with the canceled check showing that he paid his HOA fees in full. The HOA rep apologized and said he would have the locksmith cancel the towing order. But our neighbor said, "No, I think I'm gonna make a complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, specifically with the HOA." The HOA rep got scared and backed away. He told our neighbor he would look into it and he would get back to him. Our neighbor closed the door. At that point, our neighbor went out on the lake to cool off and relax. It was hot outside and the lake was beautiful. The sun was shining and the waves were calm. It was perfect. Well, while he was out there, the HOA rep called him and yelled at him for calling the police on the security team. Our neighbor was dumbfounded. He said he had every right to call the police. The HOA rep threatened him with fines and penalties. Our neighbor laughed at him and hung up. An hour later, he heard a loud bang on his front door. He looked up to see two burly men in security uniforms and a locksmith standing on his porch. The HOA rep must have called a backup because these guys were big. One of the guys asked our neighbor if he was Mr. Neighbor's name. Our neighbor said, "Yes, but how did you get in?" The guy says, "I don't know about you, but I thought you were supposed to have the best security system on the planet." "How did I get in?" "Easy. Someone let me in." And that's when our neighbor got pissed. He opened the door wide and asked them to come in. But they didn't. They just stood there blocking the door. He asked them again to come in, but they refused. He got mad and slammed the door in their faces. The guy immediately starts pounding on the door and yelling for our neighbor to open up. Our neighbor comes back to the door and looks through the peephole and sees the guy breathing heavily, trying to break down the door. He turns and goes back to his office. He calls the police and tells them that some guys are trying to break down his door. When the police arrive, they bust the guys off our neighbor's porch. As they're arresting the guys, the locksmith is trying to pick the lock and get in. The officer sees him and tells him to stop. He then arrests the locksmith. Our neighbor comes out and tells the officers what happened. He explains that the guys wouldn't come in and they were trying to force their way in. The officer asks him if he wants to press charges and he says, "Hell yeah." Well, the next day, the HOA calls our neighbor to ask why he pressed charges against their security team and the locksmith. Our neighbor tells them that they trespassed onto his private property. He also tells them that they should check with the police about what happened last night. The HOA rep apologizes and says that they would look into it and get back to him. But our neighbor says, "No, I think I'm gonna sue you." And that's when the HOA cowered. The HOA had to pay our neighbor over $30,000 for damages and attorney fees. Not to mention, they had to pay for the arrest and incarceration of the security team and the locksmith. The security team ended up pleading no contest to trespassing charges and were given 100 hours of community service and 6 months probation. The locksmith pleaded guilty to attempted burglary and served 45 days in jail and 6 months probation. And that's where the story gets weird. After all of this happened, our neighbor started getting death threats. He didn't know who they were from, so he reported it to the police. The police investigated and found out it was the ex-security team and the locksmith. They were mad at our neighbor for putting them in jail, and they were taking it out on him. They were even planning on beating him up, but the police stopped them. The judge revoked their probation, and they were sentenced to serve the full year in jail. Now, here's the weird part. The HOA had to pay our neighbor $30,000 for the lawyer bills. Well, our neighbor went and got himself a really good lawyer. You know, the type that's really expensive. He also hired a security company to protect his family and his home. He had to install new locks on all of his doors and windows, and he had to reprogram his security system. But he had a lot of other bills too. He had to pay for therapy for his wife and kids because they were terrified of what would happen next. Well, our neighbor gets the bill from his lawyer, and it was for $180,000. He tells the HOA, and they tell him that's way too much. We're only gonna pay for $30,000 worth of legal fees. He tells them that's not gonna cover anything. They tell him tough luck, that's all you're gonna get. He tells them he's gonna sue them for the rest of it. They tell him, knock yourself out. Well, our neighbor did. He filed a lawsuit against the HOA for the remaining $150,000. And that's when the HOA got scared. They didn't want to go to court. They didn't want to pay another dime to this man. So they cut him a check for the full amount. They didn't even try to fight him on it. This whole story is absolutely amazing. This guy put up a good fight and he won. He didn't let the HOA bully him around, and that's what it takes sometimes. Sometimes you just have to stand up for yourself. And this guy did, and he won. He shattered their shins.